One of the most recognized images in the Fallout universe is the distant skyline of New Vegas. The faint, warm glow of the Strip visible from far across the wasteland. That glow was not designed to be seen from a distance. The neon light of the Strip was placed as a background texture, intended to serve as atmosphere rather than a navigational landmark. It was not expected that anyone standing on a mountain pass more than a kilometer away would look toward the horizon and find it waiting. Yet the texture caught the light in a way that was never anticipated, and the effect remained. It has since become one of the most quietly beloved details in the entire wasteland, a happy accident that no one corrected because no one wanted to. Another small accident lives on the exterior of the Lucky 38 casino itself. The Lucky 38's logo features a roulette wheel, and roulette wheels follow a precise alternating sequence of red and black pockets that has been standardized across casinos for well over a century. The wheel on the Lucky 38's logo does not follow that sequence. The colors are arranged incorrectly. Whether this detail was overlooked during production or placed there deliberately, as a subtle suggestion that the man who owns the Lucky 38 plays by no one's rules but his own, has never been confirmed. It remains quietly wrong on the face of the most powerful building in the wasteland. The rules of New Vegas extend even into its smallest entertainments. Caravan, the card game encountered throughout the Mojave, was designed as a complete and functional game with its own consistent internal rule set. It can be studied, practiced, and won through genuine strategic thinking. The mechanics hold together. The design is sound. And yet, the vast majority of those who passed through the wasteland never learned how Caravan worked at all. They declined every invitation, moved past every table, and left the game unplayed in the corners of settlements and saloons across the desert. An entire system of rules was built and placed inside the wasteland, and the wasteland kept it regardless. Scattered across that same wasteland, the highway signs carry details that were never invented. The road signs throughout the Mojave use authentic Nevada state road sign fonts, and the route numbers printed on them correspond to real American highways. Route 93, which appears repeatedly along the game's southern corridor, is a genuine United States highway running through Nevada and connecting to Boulder City, the same city it connects to in the ruins of the Mojave. The geography was not fabricated. It was borrowed from the real world and left in place, slightly damaged, slightly overgrown, but still pointing in the right direction. The same faithfulness to real geography shaped the town of Goodsprings, where the courier first opens their eyes. Goodsprings is a real settlement in southern Nevada, located along the old path of US Route 91. The Prospector Saloon, the general store, and the cemetery that sits on a small rise outside of town were all modeled on their actual counterparts. In the real world, Goodsprings has fewer than 300 residents and is considered one of the most intact ghost towns in the American Southwest. The wasteland version is not an invention. It is a rendering of something that already existed, placed carefully into a world that had ended and then kept going without it. Beneath the surface of that cemetery, the details grow quieter still. The grave markers in the Goodsprings Cemetery carry names that are never explained, never referenced in any terminal entry, any conversation, or any recovered document. One grave belongs to someone recorded only as unknown traveler. No account exists of who this person was, how they arrived, or what brought their journey to an end in this particular patch of desert. The marker was placed there to imply a history that the wasteland was not prepared to share. It remains as it was left, unnamed, unanswered, and quietly present. The courier who walks past that grave carries a similar quality of anonymity. No canonical name was ever assigned. No fixed backstory was ever established. The character was designed to remain a kind of vessel, a presence defined entirely by what the person inhabiting the role decided to do with it. Throughout the entire period of the courier's development, internal records referred to the character by no other name than the title they carried: the courier. Nothing more. There is also a detail connected to how that courier came to be carrying the package that led to everything. The Mojave Express employed 7 couriers for the platinum chip delivery route. The one who accepted the job was the last to be asked. The other 6 had already turned it down, and their reasons were never recorded in any surviving document. They declined, and the 7th took the job, and the story that followed was built entirely on that quiet chain of refusals. The object at the center of that chain, the platinum chip that Benny used as justification to fire a bullet into the courier's head, is not made of platinum. The name describes the casing's color and finish, nothing more. Beneath the surface, the chip is a data storage device. It contains upgrade codes for the Securitron army, sealed beneath the Lucky 38. Its material worth is negligible. Its strategic worth was enough to bring the entire Mojave to the edge of war, which is perhaps the most honest thing the wasteland has ever said about the relationship between appearance and value. Even the first weapon placed in the courier's hands carries a hidden layer. The weathered 10mm pistol provided by Doc Mitchell at the start of the long road ahead was built with a texture file found nowhere else in the wasteland. It is more worn, more scarred, more visibly used than any other version of that weapon. The texture was created specifically for this single item, even though the vast majority of those who carried it replaced it within the first hour of travel. A unique asset was designed for an object almost no one holds onto. The care exists regardless of whether anyone notices it. Similarly, the regional soft drink Sunset Sarsaparilla holds 37 distinct cap designs across its bottles, each one a separate texture, each one different from the last. Most of those who collect the caps will never encounter all 37. The differences are small enough that they pass unnoticed in the steady rhythm of exploration. 37 individual designs were made for a collectible that the average traveler finds perhaps 20 of. The rest remain hidden in corners and containers throughout the wasteland, waiting for someone patient enough to look. In the Mojave, even the smallest things were built with a kind of quiet care, as if someone believed that a wasteland worth living in was also a wasteland worth designing, down to the last bottle cap. Robert Edwin House was born on June 25th, 2020, and by the time the world ended, he was the wealthiest man in pre-war America. He had spent years calculating the precise moment the bombs would fall, arriving at a figure that was accurate to within 94%. That margin gave him enough time to seal himself inside a life support pod deep within the Lucky 38 casino, to sterilize his environment and to wait. He was wrong by only 20 hours. Those 20 hours were enough to begin a deterioration that 2 centuries of machine-assisted survival could not reverse. The evidence of that deterioration is visible to anyone who travels deep enough into the Lucky 38. Mr. House's physical body, kept alive by an elaborate system of tubes, monitors, and sealed environmental controls, is shown on a screen within his private suite, dried and shrunken beyond what most would expect to find beneath a man of such calculated power. No companion remarks on what they are seeing. No terminal entry describes it. The image is simply allowed to exist, presented without commentary, visible to those who look and invisible to those who do not. In the wasteland, even the most disturbing truths are sometimes left to speak entirely for themselves. That same silence surrounds much of what was built along the Strip. The Tops Casino was designed to evoke a very specific moment in American entertainment history. The lounges and ballrooms of 1950s Las Vegas, the era of tailored suits and late-night performances, and the particular mythology that grew around those years. The chairman, the gang who inhabit the Tops, were shaped around that cultural memory. Their clothing, their manner of speaking, and the music drifting through the casino's halls were all drawn from a period that had already been 50 years in the past before the first bomb was ever dropped. The Strip, in this sense, is nostalgia constructed upon nostalgia, a performance of a performance preserved in amber and neon. The ultra-luxe casino carries its own hidden layer, one that was designed to be discovered rather than announced. The menu displayed at the ultra-luxe's entrance, the first thing encountered before the White Glove Society's composed and mannered hospitality, contains several dishes whose descriptions do not correspond to any recognized animal. The language is careful, elegant, and deliberately vague. The menu was written to hold a clue within it. Those who read it closely and then continued to explore the casino's quieter rooms would eventually find that the clue was not decorative. It was accurate. Hidden information also exists within the Gomorrah Casino, though the Gomorrah makes no effort to disguise its intentions with fine dining menus or tailored suits. A terminal located in a back room of the Gomorrah's inner areas remains unlocked and entirely accessible to anyone who walks through the door. That terminal contains the full details of a conspiracy, a plan by the Omerta's gang to release a chemical weapon onto the Strip itself. The information was never placed behind a locked door. It was never flagged, never guarded in any meaningful way. Those who explored without direction could read the entire design of the plot before any formal investigation was ever prompted. Unfinished documentation was also discovered within the Lucky 38 itself. The cocktail lounge level of the casino contains terminals that were never fully prepared before the building's records were sealed. At least one of those terminals retains what appears to be internal placeholder text, notes that were meant to be replaced before the final version of the records was set. They were not replaced. They remained incorporated into the Lucky 38's archives, read by those who explored the lounge without any indication that what they were reading was never intended to be there. There is also a connection between the machines that fill the Lucky 38's halls and the device carried by the courier throughout the long road across the Mojave. The Securitrons, the round-screened robots that serve as Mr. House's standing force, run on Robco's unified operating system. That same operating system forms the foundation of the Pip-Boy worn on the courier's wrist. The two devices, separated by function and form, share a common software architecture. The detail is not announced. It is buried in terminal entries and cross-referenced lore, waiting for those who read carefully enough to notice the connection between an army and a wrist-mounted computer. The army itself remains entirely unseen. Beneath Hoover Dam, a sealed vault is said to house thousands of upgraded Securitrons, all waiting for Mr. House's signal. The door to that vault is present in the world, a physical structure, solid and imposing. But there is nothing behind it. No chamber exists on the other side. The entire force that would determine the future of the Mojave is represented by a locked door and the records that describe what lies beyond it. The wasteland's most consequential army exists, in practice, as a promise. Mr. House himself exists in a similar form. His presence throughout the wasteland is communicated entirely through screens. His voice was recorded without the actor ever seeing the body that voice was meant to inhabit. René Auberjonois, who gave House his measured and deliberate manner of speaking, performed the role with no visual reference for the deteriorated figure in the life support pod. A man who controls the strip through broadcast, who governs through transmission rather than presence, was also brought to life by a performance constructed entirely in the absence of a face. 3 conclusions exist for Mr. House's long story. He can be left alive, placed in stasis, or removed from the equation entirely. Only one of those conclusions allows him to speak about what comes next. A quiet monologue about the stars, about survival beyond the wasteland, about the long arc of human civilization, bending towards something larger than any faction or any battle over a dam. That monologue was among the last pieces of dialogue added before the records of his story were sealed. Not all factions in the wasteland can be driven to permanent hostility. The followers of the apocalypse, the humanitarian organization that maintains medical facilities and recovered knowledge, cannot be made into enemies through the actions available to the courier. The same is true of the New California Republic. Every other organized force in the Mojave can be turned against the courier through the right combination of choices. Only the doctors and the soldiers of the Republic remain permanently accessible, regardless of how the road between them has been traveled. The road between those factions runs through Freeside, the district that exists just outside the walls of the Strip. Freeside was designed to carry the economic reality that concentrated wealth has always produced around itself, the settlement of those who could not get inside, pressing close to the light without being able to reach it. The residents of Freeside were given dialogue that responds to the courier's standing with different factions in ways that most other districts do not replicate. A courier who is aligned deeply with Mr. House will be addressed differently than one who has walked with the Republic. The difference requires paying attention to dozens of short exchanges to detect. It is there regardless. The Strip was built to convince people that fortune was within reach. The Freeside locals, sleeping just outside its walls, were the quiet answer to that promise. The Mojave wasteland did not produce its factions in isolation. The 2 great powers that face each other across the Colorado River both carry histories that stretch back well beyond the boundaries of New Vegas itself. Histories rooted in other games, other eras, other decisions made by people who are long dead. To understand what the New California Republic and Caesar's Legion are, it is necessary to understand what they were and what they were built upon and how far the consequences of that construction have traveled. The New California Republic began as something much smaller. Its origins trace directly to Shady Sands, a modest farming settlement established by survivors of Vault-15 in the year 2161. The same period documented in the original Fallout. What began as a handful of people trying to grow food in the ruins of California became, over generations, a functioning republic with its own government, its own military, and eventually its own capital. By the time the courier arrives in the Mojave, Shady Sands has long since become that capital. The Fallout television series would later depict its destruction, a city that rose from a vault's survivors reduced once more to rubble, its end arriving through means as catastrophic as the war that shaped its beginning. A civilization built over more than a century, gone. Caesar's origins are quieter and far less visible to those who never pursue the full account. The man who calls himself Caesar was born Edward Sallow. His real name is not revealed through any primary record. It surfaces only through the personal history of Arcade Gannon, a companion whose own quest can be completed without the main conflict ever reaching its conclusion. Sallow was once a scholar, affiliated with the Followers of the Apocalypse, an organization devoted to preserving knowledge and providing humanitarian aid. He studied pre-war history, He read texts that were never intended to serve as operational manuals. He used them anyway. The structure he built from those texts was designed with a specificity that most who encountered it never recognized. Caesar's legion is modeled on the military organization of the late Roman Republic, not Rome at its most imperial or its most mythologized, but the Republic in its specific administrative and martial form. The ranks used by legion soldiers are authentic Latin titles: legionary, decanus, centurion, legate. The hierarchy these titles describe was drawn from historical records and applied with internal consistency across the entire organization. A language dead for centuries was placed back into operational use, worn like armor across the desert. The soldiers who carry those titles were designed to feel unlike any other organized force in the Mojave. At legion encampments, no soldier is ever seen eating, resting, or engaged in any behavior that suggests a life existing outside of function. Sleeping areas are present. Supply crates line the walls. Nothing is ever interacted with in any idle capacity. The Legion was designed to present itself as mechanism rather than community, a force that moves, occupies, and holds, but does not appear to live in any recognizable sense. The effect is a kind of unease that no other faction produces, because no other faction so completely removes the visible evidence of its own humanity. The humanity that the Legion removes most completely belongs to those it has enslaved. At Fortification Hill, the Legion's primary camp on the eastern side of the Colorado, enslaved people are present as background figures, unnamed, without dialogue, without any interactive element. Their suffering is not hidden. It is simply made unremarkable, absorbed into the landscape of the camp the same way the supply crates and tent structures are absorbed. The invisibility was designed into their presence. In the wasteland, the most effective way to normalize something is to refuse to comment on it at all. The New California Republic comments on its own problems constantly, though rarely through anyone in a position of authority. Across every NCR military installation in the Mojave, soldiers speak about supply shortages, inadequate compensation, and conditions that fall far below what was promised when they enlisted. These complaints were written into the background dialogue of nearly every NCR location as a deliberate reflection of a historical pattern. The overextension of a republic whose military commitments have grown faster than the economic foundation required to support them. The NCR is an institution failing in slow motion, and the soldiers posted at its forward positions are the most visible evidence of that failure. The leadership responsible for those positions remains largely absent. General Lee Oliver, the commanding officer of NCR forces in the Mojave, is physically present in the world for only a small portion of the events surrounding the dam. His name appears in terminal entries. His orders reach the camps through intermediaries. He is encountered in person only as the conflict reaches its final stage, and even then briefly. His command is communicated primarily through the distance between himself and the people carrying out his decisions, a distance that is itself a form of design, intended to show what institutional leadership looks like when it has grown too large to remain close to its own consequences. Legate Lanius, the Legion's counterpart to Oliver, he was originally developed with a history that would have made him legible in a similar way. Records from before the final version of his story was settled describe him as a former tribal warrior whose own community was destroyed by the Legion before he chose to join it, a detail that would have made his loyalty a matter of survival and absorption rather than conviction. In the account that survived to completion, This history is accessible only through a single exchange that most who encountered him never pursued. The depth exists. It simply requires knowing where to look. That quality of buried depth runs through the great Khans as well. The Khans present in the Mojave are the remnants of a raider tribe that appeared in the first and second Fallout. She's surviving across more than 100 years of in-universe history and carrying the accumulated weight of every conflict that history contains. The Bitter Springs Massacre, an NCR military action that came close to destroying the Khans entirely, is not ancient lore to the people living in Red Rock Canyon. It is recent memory, still shaping the decisions of everyone who survived it. The chemical trade that the Khans used to sustain themselves in the Mojave also carries a longer history than most realize. Jet, the stimulant manufactured and distributed by the Khans, was first produced by a young chemist named Myron in the city of New Reno, a character documented in Fallout 2, released in 1998. Myron developed the substance by fermenting Brahmin waste into a refined compound that became one of the wasteland's most addictive and widely distributed chems. The supply chain running through Red Rock Canyon can be traced, through careful reading of available records, back to a specific person in a specific city in a game set decades before the courier ever opened their eyes. The sounds of Camp McCarran carry their own buried history. The camp, built within the structure of a pre-war commercial airport, retains a faint looping announcement in its terminal building, a recording of flight information cycling through destinations and departure times that no longer exist and no aircraft will ever serve. The recording was layered into the ambient sound of the location as a design detail, not intended to be noticed by those who did not listen for it. It plays regardless, informing no one of flights that stopped running more than 2 centuries ago. 2 years before the courier arrived in the Mojave, the new California Republic and Caesar's Legion had already fought once over Hoover Dam. The NCR held the dam at the end of that first engagement and paid for it in thousands of lives. The events of New Vegas begin in the pause that followed, a period of recovery, repositioning, and preparation on both sides, each waiting for conditions to favor a second attempt. The entire story of the Mojave, all its factions and decisions and consequences, unfolds inside that pause. Between the first battle and the second, 2 years passed in the desert. In the wasteland, 2 years is enough time for a civilization to rise and fall, or simply to reload. Between the two great armies pressing toward each other across the Mojave, there exists a smaller and more personal kind of history, carried not by factions or institutions, but by individuals. The companions who walk alongside the courier across the desert each bring a past that is rarely displayed in full and never summarized. Their stories require patience. They surface gradually, in fragments, over long stretches of travel through the wasteland, and the picture they form is rarely complete by the time the road ends. New Vegas was built around 8 permanent companions, more than any other entry in the Fallout series had offered before or since. Each companion was assigned a dedicated writer, and each was given a personal quest that, when completed, produced a permanent change in how that companion behaved and fought. The companion system was the final major system to be finalized before the full account of the Mojave was sealed for release. The weight placed on those 8 characters and the care taken with each of them is evident in how much each one carries without appearing to. Craig Boone carries it most visibly, though he rarely speaks about it. His wife, Carla, was sold into Legion slavery, and Boone shot her himself rather than allow what would have followed. The account of this is delivered in fragments, across conversations that Boone resists and deflects. He does not offer the information. It has to be found through persistence, through returning to him again and again until the edges of the story become clear. Guy, his red beret, the identifier of the 1st Recon Marksman unit he served with, is the only outward mark of everything that preceded the courier's arrival in Novak. He never removes it. EDE carries its history in a different form. The small Ibot found in Prim was designated by the Enclave, the remnant federal organization documented across Fallout 2 and Fallout 3, as Ibot Duraframe Subject E, an experimental chassis constructed at the Enclave installation in Navarro, along the California coast. EDE is a military prototype operating in the Mojave, without any handler, without any active connection to the organization that built it. Its full account is not delivered through conversation. It is released automatically in audio logs that play under specific conditions, building the picture of where it came from without requiring anyone to ask. The connection between Veronica Santangelo and a woman named Christine is built in a similar way, revealed not through direct statement, but through the accumulation of indirect evidence. Veronica, a Brotherhood of Steel scribe encountered at the 188 trading post, carries a history involving another member of the Brotherhood, a relationship that ended badly and was never fully explained. Christine Royce, who later appears in the Sierra Madre casino during the events documented in Dead Money, is that same person. Those who completed both Veronica's personal quest and the full account of the Sierra Madre could find a moment where the connection became clear, assembled from details that were never labeled or flagged. The link was placed there for those who paid close enough attention. Arcade Israel. Gannon's connection to the past is genetic as much as personal. The son of an Enclave officer, Arcade carries the lineage of an organization responsible for some of the most deliberate suffering in the wasteland's documented history. His personal quest brings him back into contact with a group of former Enclave soldiers, men who served under that organization and have since built quiet lives far from what they once were. What the quest offers for those who complete it is one of the only moments in the Fallout series where forgiveness is extended not abstractly, but specifically toward people with known histories of harm, because those people are also family. She Rose of Sharon Cassidy, known throughout the Mojave simply as Cass, carries a generational connection that she herself is never made aware of. Her father, John Cassidy, was a traveling wanderer documented in Fallout 2, where he served as a companion to the Chosen One. Cass is his daughter. The detail surfaces in a single piece of optional dialogue and requires no follow-up. It is not a revelation the story builds toward. It is simply there for those who find it, quietly establishing that the people moving through the wasteland are not isolated individuals, but the accumulated result of generations of surviving. Rex was already known in Freeside before the courier ever reached the city. The cybernetic canine, a pre-war military platform given a life that has extended well beyond its original parameters, had been the companion of the king, the leader of the gang that controls the streets outside the Strip, for long enough that his name was recognized by those who lived there. Several residents mention him before any formal introduction occurs. He has a history and a reputation that exist entirely outside the courier's story, and that history does not require the courier to be present for it to matter. Raul Alfonso Tejada has been accumulating history for approximately 235 years. Born before the Great War, he is among the oldest living beings in the Mojave, a ghoul who survived the bombs and everything that followed and carries, in his memory, a world that no longer exists in any other form. He remembers the layout of streets in Mexico City. He remembers specific foods. He remembers music that has not been performed by a living musician in 2 centuries. His memories of the pre-war world are among the most detailed and personal available in any Fallout record, accessible only through extended optional conversation. Lily Bowen's memories of what she was are being taken from her. Before the forced evolutionary virus, the FEV, transformed her into the nightkin she is now, Lily was a grandmother living in a farming community, raising grandchildren and carrying the ordinary weight of an ordinary life. The locket she still wears contains photographs of those grandchildren. The stealth boy psychosis that afflicts all nightkin is progressively replacing her memories of them, name by name. When the courier first finds her, her granddaughter Jennifer is the last name she can still hold on to. It is not clear how long that will remain true. Names are not always lost. Sometimes they are constructed from the world as it was found. Follows. Chalk, a young member of the Dead Horses tribe, encountered in Zion National Park during the events of Honest Hearts, was named according to his tribe's tradition. The first thing a mother sees after birth becomes the name of the child she has just brought into the wasteland. His mother saw the chalk markings used to mark safe trails through the canyon terrain. His name is not symbolic or chosen. It is an accident of geography, preserved as identity. Yes Man's identity was engineered for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with the courier. The Securitron was reprogrammed by Benny, the chairman leader whose ambitions extended to controlling the entire strip, and the personality installed in that reprogramming was designed around a single functional requirement: the inability to refuse. Benny needed a machine that would comply without exception. Yes, man was built to be that machine. The partnership that later forms between Yes Man and the courier is built entirely on a foundation of engineered compliance, a relationship in which one party was constructed specifically to have no other option. Deeper still, within the Sierra Madre casino, encountered through the events of Dead Money, a being known as Dog, and God exists as 2 identities within a single body. The super mutant who carries both names was divided by years of conditioning under Father Elijah, the rogue Brotherhood of Steel elder who used punishment and isolation to reduce a thinking being into something obedient and simple. Dog is what that conditioning produced. God is what remained underneath it, aware, angry, suppressed. Those who explored the full account of the Sierra Madre were given the option to attempt a resolution, to work toward a third state that was neither the conditioned self nor the buried one, but something more complete. Every companion carries something the Mojave has not finished taking from them. The question is whether the courier can help them hold on to it, or whether the wasteland gets everything in the end. Beneath the Mojave, sealed behind heavy doors and layers of concrete and time, the vaults of Vault-Tec continue to exist. Some have been opened. Some have been discovered and left largely undisturbed. A few remain entirely unknown to those who walk the desert above them. Each one was designed with a purpose, and each purpose was the same at its core. Not survival, not shelter, but observation. The vaults were built to watch what human beings do when they have nowhere else to go. Vault 21 sits directly beneath the New Vegas Strip, its upper levels converted into a hotel that serves the wealthier travelers who pass through the area. The original vault was designed around a single governing principle. Every dispute among its inhabitants was to be resolved through gambling. Ownership of living quarters, allocation of food, access to resources, all of it settled at the gaming table. The design produced a community bound entirely by chance and strategy, by the willingness to risk what one had against the possibility of gaining what one needed. Mr. House purchased the vault and had its lower levels filled with cement, sealing whatever remained of that community beneath a layer of hardened grey permanence. The hotel above it does not advertise what lies beneath. The woman who manages that hotel carries the memory in a form that most visitors never access. Sarah, a direct descendant of the original vault overseer, speaks about the sealing process in optional conversation, describing not the decision or the politics surrounding it, but the sound, the noise of the cement mixers, the particular quality of that sound as it continued for hours, while the lower levels were closed off forever. It is among the most specific sensory details preserved in any account of the Mojave's sealed places, and it exists only for those who ask. Vault 11 preserved a different kind of memory. That vault was designed around a requirement. Each year, the inhabitants were to select one of their own to be sacrificed to the vault's controlling system. Compliance was rewarded with continued operation of the vault's life support. Refusal was presented as catastrophic. For years, the residents of Vault 11 complied, selecting one person each year to be brought forward. In the final year, the survivors refused. They sent no one. The system's response to that refusal was to announce that the experiment had been passed, that the vault's population would be spared, as promised, in recognition of their defiance. There was no population left to spare. The vault rewarded the correct moral choice at a point where that reward could no longer reach anyone capable of receiving it. The experiment at Vault 11 was not unique in its cruelty, only in its particular form. Vault-Tec's Vault program, as documented across the full scope of surviving records and confirmed through accounts recovered in the events depicted in the Fallout television series, was not designed primarily as a survival initiative. The shelters were built and stocked and sealed, but their fundamental purpose was data collection, the systematic study of human behavior under controlled conditions of isolation, scarcity, and stress. The surface world, where those without vault assignments lived and died without observation, served as the control group against which the vault's results were measured. The residents were not being saved. They were being studied. The question of what became of that data has no complete answer. Terminal entries recovered in the Commonwealth, the regions surrounding what was once Boston, documented in Fallout 4, suggest that the Institute, the secretive organization responsible for creating synthetic humans indistinguishable from biological ones, may have had access to pre-war behavioral research conducted by corporate entities. If the data gathered from Mojave Vault experiments traveled east before the bombs fell, it may have informed the early studies that eventually produced the Institute's most significant and troubling work. The connection is suggested by implication rather than confirmed by direct record. The wasteland rarely provides clean documentation. Vault 34 received its own form of data collection, built around a more direct hypothesis. The vault was designed with an overstocked armory, weapons and ammunition in quantities far exceeding what any reasonable survival scenario would require, made fully accessible to all residents from the beginning. The experiment was to observe what a sealed population did with unlimited access to weapons over an extended period. The terminal entries that survive within the vault describe the outcome with the tone of records that have no reason left to be surprised. Factional conflict developed. Power consolidated. The vault failed. The armory still contains fully loaded weapon caches. The residents are now feral ghouls moving through the darkness beneath the desert. The forced evolutionary virus, the FEV, was applied to sealed populations as well, though the application at Vault 87 in the capital wasteland, documented in Fallout 3, was designed from the beginning as a transformation rather than an observation. The virus was released directly into the Vault's population, producing the super mutants that came to define the dangers of the ruins surrounding what had once been Washington. The Mojave's own super mutant population traces back to a different origin, the Mariposa military base in California, where a separate strain of the FEV was used under different conditions. The two strains produced different results. The super mutants encountered in the capital wasteland and those found in the Mojave are not the same beings, despite sharing a common origin in the same fundamental science. Vault-22 was designed around a different kind of transformation. The Vault was used to study pest-resistant plant strains, with the intention of developing agricultural solutions that could sustain sealed populations over long periods. The plants placed under study evolved beyond the parameters the experiment was designed to observe. A spore was produced, something the plants had not been designed to generate, and that spore infected the Vault's inhabitants, producing a biological outcome that no design specification had anticipated. The Vault is now among the most dangerous biological environments in the Mojave. One terminal entry notes, without apparent irony, that the soil within Vault-22 is the most fertile in the region. The danger and the fertility exist in the same place, because the same process produced both. The settlement known as the Divide was not a vault, but it was sealed in its own way. The community that existed there was destroyed by a delivery, a package carried by the courier without knowledge of what it contained or what its arrival would activate. Dormant nuclear devices buried beneath the settlement responded to a signal within the package. And the community was erased before it had been given enough time to acquire a name. One person survived. Ulysses, a man who had already watched one community be absorbed and dissolved by Caesar's legion, who had already experienced the erasure of a name he had claimed as his own, was present when the Divide was destroyed, and he was not destroyed with it. He has been waiting since then, holding the account of what happened, wanting the courier to understand what was carried into that settlement and left behind. Ulysses was once a member of the Twisted Hares, a tribal group that entered into an alliance with Caesar's legion during the legion's expansion through the southwest. The alliance was honored in the sense that the Twisted Hares' cooperation was accepted and used. It was not honored in the sense that the Twisted Hares were then absorbed into the legion entirely, their identity dissolved, their name retired, their members redistributed among legion units under legion designations. The reward for cooperation was erasure. Ulysses understands the wasteland's relationship with names and symbols because he has experienced what happens when those things are taken away by a force that views identity as a resource to be consumed. The Fallout television series documented a vault system that operated on a similar understanding of identity as something to be managed and controlled. Vault 33, Vault 32, and Vault 31 were designed as a connected 3-vault structure, with Vault 31 serving a function distinct from the others. Within it, the pre-war Vault-Tec executives, preserved under the designation Buds, were held in cryogenic stasis, maintained in readiness to emerge after the initial chaos of the post-war period, and resume positions of corporate authority over whatever reconstruction followed. The design mirrors the philosophy behind Vault 76, documented in Fallout 76, which was designated a control vault, a sealed shelter for those considered most capable of leading a new civilization, to be opened first so that leadership would be established before the general population emerged. In both cases, the vault was not designed to save people equally. It was designed to ensure that specific people survived in positions of power. The Lucky 38's penthouse suite was not labeled a vault. It was not marketed as one. but it was built to the same specification, sealed before the bombs fell, environmentally controlled and stocked and maintained against the long wait that followed. Mr. House designed it as a private sealed environment for a population of one, with a single experiment at its center. Whether a man with sufficient foresight, sufficient resources, and sufficient patience could outlast every other claimant to the wasteland's future. The vaults asked what people would do when they had no choice. Mr. House answered the question by ensuring, as completely as he could, that he was never without one. The vaults were designed to ask a question. The question was always, what will people do when they have no choice? Mr. House answered the question by making sure he was never without one. Beyond the borders of the Mojave wasteland proper, 4 other territories exist, each one sealed off from the main desert by geography or catastrophe, each one containing a distinct and complete account of its own. The 4 expansions of Fallout. New Vegas were designed not as supplementary material, but as a connected series of destinations, each one assigned a specific relationship to a single shared theme. That theme is the past and what people do with it. Dead Money is about letting go. Honest Hearts is about carrying it forward. Old World Blues is about being unable to escape it. Lonesome Road is about confronting what it cost someone else. The sequence was deliberate, and the expansions were designed to be experienced in that order, each one building on the emotional and thematic foundation left by the previous one, until the full shape of the argument they collectively make becomes visible. Dead Money begins with removal. Everything the courier has accumulated, weapons, supplies, the companions who have been traveling alongside them, is taken away at the start. What remains is a bomb collar, a radio signal, and the ruins of the Sierra Madre Casino, a pre-war resort that never opened and never closed, preserved in a state of suspended abandonment behind a barrier of toxic red gas. The design was intended to produce in the courier the same condition experienced by the Sierra Madre's original guests, wealthy pre-war visitors who arrived with every advantage available to them and were still destroyed by circumstances they could not control or spend their way out of. Survival in the Sierra Madre requires letting go of the assumption that what was carried in will be enough. The cloud, the toxic red gas that fills the area surrounding the Sierra Madre, was designed with an audio layer that most who entered it never consciously registered. Beneath the ambient sound of the environment, a barely audible hiss was built into the cloud's presence, calibrated to become slightly louder as those who moved through it traveled deeper into the affected areas. In controlled testing, the change was not consciously detected. The reported effect was an increase in anxiety that had no identifiable source. The sound was left in place because it was working exactly as it was meant to. Honest Hearts carries a different relationship to sensation. Zion National Park, the setting of that expansion, was designed using real-world geographic references drawn from the actual Zion National Park in Utah. The canyon formations, the river placements, the names assigned to rock formations and trail paths all correspond to features that exist in the physical world. Those who had visited the real park before traveling through its Fallout equivalent reported that their memory of the actual geography was sufficient to navigate the ruins. The landscape was not invented. It was borrowed, damaged slightly by 2 centuries of post-war growth, and left largely as it was found. Joshua Graham was already present in the Mojave's records before he appeared in Zion. Known as the Burned Man, Caesar's first and most feared legate, thrown into the Grand Canyon after a military defeat and survived the experience through means that no account has fully explained. His name was spoken in settlements and camps long before his face was ever shown. When he finally appeared in honest hearts, always wrapped in bandages, always calm, always armed, his voice was recorded in a single, uninterrupted session. No line was recorded twice. The performance exists as it was delivered, without revision. The voices of the think tank, the 5 disembodied scientist intelligences encountered in Old World Blues, were assembled differently. Each of the 5 characters was voiced by a different actor, and each actor recorded their lines without hearing what the others had produced. The exchanges between them, which were widely noted for their comedic texture and unexpected warmth, did not emerge from actors playing off one another. They were constructed in editing, assembled from separate performances into something that sounds like conversation, because the editing made it so. The dynamic was not found. It was built. The sink, the personal quarters, assigned to the courier within the Big Mountain Research and Development Center, commonly known as Big MT, contains a collection of artificial intelligences that share that quality of assembled personality. A toaster, a jukebox, a robotic book reader. Each one was given a distinct voice and a distinct set of behaviors drawn from pre-war consumer product design philosophy. The cheerful, the authoritative, the companionable. The toaster was designed around aggression. It expresses consistently and without ambiguity a desire to harm biological organisms. It is the most hostile consumer product preserved in any wasteland record, and it was designed to be friendly. Big MT itself was designed to be useful. The facility produced technologies that traveled far beyond its borders: stealth buoys, which temporarily render the user invisible; sonic emitters, which affect biological and mechanical targets through focused sound; experimental weapon designs that appeared in military and civilian contexts across the wasteland. One terminal entry within the facility suggests that the Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted personal information device carried by the courier, also traces part of its development to Big MT. If that record is accurate, the device used to navigate the wasteland was designed in part by the same institution currently being explored. The technology and the tool share a common origin. Lonesome Road carries its own buried geography. The divide, the shattered corridor where the expansion unfolds, is threaded throughout with the iconography of US Route 66, the pre-war highway, known across America as the road of westward movement and fresh starts. The road signs remain. The familiar shield-shaped markers appear along collapsed overpasses and in the rubble of structures that once served travelers moving towards something better. Ulysses, the figure who inhabits the divide and has been waiting there, speaks about roads as a form of meaning, as the physical evidence that people once believed strongly enough in a destination to build a path toward it. Route 66 is a road built on that belief, now buried under the consequences of what that belief eventually produced. Ulysses carries a flag through all of it, a pre-war American flag kept in a condition that suggests deliberate care, travels with him through the ruins of the divide. If the confrontation between Ulysses and the courier is resolved without violence, if the argument he has been constructing across the full length of the divide is met and answered, he gives the flag away. It is the only object in the Mojave's full record that represents the pre-war United States as something a living person still grieves. It weighs 1 pound. It has no other measurable value. The weight of a symbol is not recorded in any unit the wasteland uses. The endings of each expansion were designed to respond to choices made within other expansions. Those who completed all 4 territories before reaching the divide's conclusion could find that certain outcomes referenced events from earlier accounts. small acknowledgements that the full journey had been made, built into the slides for those who had traveled the complete distance. These variations were seen by a small fraction of those who entered the wasteland. They exist regardless. The base account of New Vegas closes in a similar spirit of accumulated consequence. Over 200 individual outcome slides were designed to cover the range of possible conclusions across all factions, locations, and individuals encountered across the full length of the Mojave. The combinations available across all possible choices number in the hundreds of thousands. No two complete accounts of the Mojave, traveled with different decisions, would produce the same ending. The wasteland was designed to be unrepeatable, to give each journey through it a conclusion that belongs entirely to the person who made it. The DLC worlds were each a door leading away from the Mojave, and each one led, eventually, back. Because the wasteland has a way of pulling people home, even when home is the thing that broke them. The Mojave wasteland communicates through more than what can be seen. Beneath the surface of every location, beneath the visual design of every ruined building and wind-scoured highway, a second layer of information was constructed from sound. That layer was built with the same care given to the physical world, and in several cases with greater precision, because sound reaches places that sight cannot, and it remains long after the eye has moved on. The ambient sound of the open Mojave was designed to change across the hours of the day in ways that most who traveled through it never consciously identified. At 3 a.m, the background audio of the desert drops by approximately 40% in total volume. The wind layer, which runs beneath the sound of the environment during daylight and evening hours, disappears entirely. What remains is a silence that those who designed it described as the sound of nothing surviving. A specific, calibrated absence meant to communicate danger without using any signal that the mind could consciously interpret as a warning. The Mojave, at night, was designed to feel wrong in a way that could not be easily named. Radio New Vegas operates as a counterpoint to that silence, broadcasting across the Mojave through a signal strong enough to reach most of the desert's populated areas. The station does more than play music. The news updates delivered between songs were designed to respond to events as they unfolded, to acknowledge, in the measured and companionable voice of its host, what had recently happened in the wasteland. Those who listened carefully found that the station was always current, always aware, always reporting on the immediate past. No other presence in the Mojave maintains that level of consistent attention to what its inhabitants are doing. The voice that delivers those reports belongs to Wayne Newton, the entertainer whose career was built in the real Las Vegas across the latter half of the 20th century. Newton was chosen specifically because of his association with the city whose ruins the station broadcasts from, because his voice carried a connection to the actual place that could not be replicated by any other casting decision. Recordings made for the station but not incorporated into the final broadcast exist within the archives of the Lucky 38 systems, are referencing events and outcomes that were prepared for but ultimately never came to pass. The station was designed with more to say than it was ultimately given the opportunity to say. The casinos that the station broadcasts into were each given their own sonic identity, distinct from one another in ways that communicate without language. The Tops Casino plays big band swing, the sound of a specific era of American entertainment that the chairmen have made their defining aesthetic. The Ultra Luxe plays chamber music and orchestral arrangements, reflecting the controlled, elevated presentation that the White Glove Society maintains in every visible aspect of their operation. The Gomorrah plays jazz weighted with minor keys, slower and heavier than what fills the other establishments. communicating through its sound design something about the nature of what the omertas offer that the decor alone does not fully express. Each casino was given a voice, and each voice was chosen to say something true about the people who run it. In the open wasteland, between the casinos and the settlements and the ruins, sound was designed to respond to terrain. Rocky mountain areas carry a different wind pattern than the flat salt flats to the south, which in turn carry a different pattern than the scrubland that covers much of the central Mojave. A layered procedural system was built to manage these variations, a significant technical undertaking designed to produce an effect that would only be experienced by those who moved through the wilderness, without any particular destination in mind. The engineering was done for the experience of being alone in the desert, which most who traveled the Mojave spent considerable effort avoiding. The vaults beneath the desert carry their own consistent sound. Every vault interior shares a foundational hum, a low, continuous tone produced at approximately 60 Hz, representing the operation of the life support and environmental control systems that keep the sealed spaces habitable. 60 Hz is also the standard frequency of alternating electrical current as it was distributed through pre-war American infrastructure. The vaults were designed to hum at the same frequency as the civilization that built them, producing a sound that connects every sealed space to the world that sealed it. In the wasteland, even silence has an architecture. The Lucky 38 carries a variation of that architecture in its music. The orchestral pieces designed for the interior of Mr. House's casino were built to feel almost correct, almost appropriate for the style they were imitating, almost comfortable, almost familiar. Several of the compositions contain small harmonic choices that diverge from what the surrounding musical context would lead a careful listener to expect. The deviations are subtle enough that they do not announce themselves. They create instead a background sense of unease in those who remain within the casino's walls, long enough for the feeling to accumulate. Mr. House's environment was designed to be almost right, because something almost right produces a discomfort that something clearly wrong never achieves. Black Mountain Radio offers a different kind of almost. The broadcast, hosted by Tabitha, a nightkin who controls the radio installation at Black Mountain and uses it to communicate her perspective on the wasteland and those who inhabit it, reaches areas that can be visited before any formal account of Black Mountain or its occupant has been established. Those who entered range of the signal in the early stages of their travel through the Mojave heard a voice discussing plans, grievances, and an ongoing disagreement with a robot companion named Rhonda, without any context that would make the source of that voice legible. Tabitha's full character, her intelligence, her isolation, her particular form of damage, was designed to be communicated entirely through what the radio transmitted. The broadcast was her introduction, and for many, it was the only introduction they ever sought. Shah Dead Money offers no radio. The account of the Sierra Madre casino that unfolds within its boundaries was designed without musical background in most of its locations, without broadcast, without the ambient warmth that Radio New Vegas provides to the open desert. The composition was built around absence, around the specific quality of silence that occurs when the ambient tones and occasional percussion that do exist within the villa are interrupted by the static of the old resort's still functioning public address system. Those who spent extended time within the Sierra Madre reported that its atmosphere felt physically heavier than the wasteland outside, as if the silence had mass. The effect was the intended one. The weapons carried through that silence were given their own precise sound design. The ballistic weapons of New Vegas were built from recordings of real firearms, layered and blended to produce sounds that carry a sense of physical space. The 10mm pistol, one of the most common weapons found across the Mojave, was constructed from 3 separate recordings of the same type of weapon fired at different distances. The close recording, the medium recording, and the far recording were combined into a single audio file. The result is a sound that contains depth, that suggests an environment responding to a gunshot rather than simply a gunshot occurring in isolation. The weapon sounds as if it exists somewhere. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted personal computer that the courier carries throughout their travels, produces a slight static texture across every radio signal it receives. That texture was not a consequence of technical limitation. It was added deliberately as an acknowledgement of what the device actually is: a salvaged machine using salvaged components to capture transmissions that were not sent for it, from sources that have been gone for more than 2 centuries. The static is the sound of distance, the distance between the world that produced the broadcasts and the world that is now receiving them through equipment held together by the pragmatic necessity of having nothing better available. Clocks throughout the Mojave display a time that does not change. The wall clocks found in preserved buildings, in vault common rooms, in the back offices of pre-war businesses, are fixed at 7:22. That time marks the moment when power was disrupted, when the detonations that ended the pre-war world interrupted the electrical systems that had been keeping those clocks accurate. The clocks stopped, and in the 2 centuries that followed, no one has moved the hands. The wasteland keeps its own time, and its time is the time of the moment everything ended. The wasteland keeps its own time. Clocks stopped at 7:22, and no one moved the hands. The world that ended at 7:22 is still ending every time someone looks up. The objects of the Mojave wasteland were not all designed with the same relationship to physical reality. Some were built to be useful. Some were built to be found. A few were built with a quiet attention to detail that exceeds any reasonable expectation of what a discarded item in a ruined world would require. Taken together, the objects scattered across the desert, from the weapons carried into battle to the bottle caps used as currency to the pencils left in desk drawers, form a secondary record of the world that made them, preserved in the particular way that only objects can preserve things, without interpretation, without sentiment, exactly as they were left. The weight system that governs what the courier can carry was designed around tension rather than accuracy. Pre-war currency, paper bills printed before the Great War, now valued primarily as kindling or decoration, weighs nothing. A single bill weighs nothing. 10,000 bills weigh nothing. The paper that once represented wealth in the old world has been rendered literally weightless by the wasteland's reordering of value. An anti-material rifle, by contrast, weighs 20 pounds. The system decided that paper is without mass, and metal is not, which reflects a certain truth about what the wasteland considers real. Within that same system, a single bottle of Nuka-Cola weighs 1 pound. The weight is fixed regardless of how many bottles are carried. 60 pounds of inventory could consist entirely of soft drinks. 60 identical glass containers of carbonated pre-war beverage and nothing else. The weight assigned to a bottle of soda was never intended to reflect physical reality. It was designed to produce decisions, to make the carrying of supplies feel like a choice with consequences. That a bottle of soda weighs the same as a loaded pistol is a compromise built into the foundation of how survival is calculated in the Mojave, and it was never revisited. Stimpaks, the standard medical injection found throughout the wasteland, were given an expanded function in New Vegas that was also never fully explained within the world they inhabit. In the original Fallout, a crippled limb required a doctor to repair. In New Vegas, a stim pack is sufficient. The change was made to reduce the frustration of seeking medical attention in a desert with limited practitioners. The in-world account of how a single injection reconstructs a shattered bone was never provided. The stim pack works because the records of the Mojave decided it should, and those records did not ask the question of how. Another small discrepancy exists within the packaging of Fancy Lad snack cakes, a pre-war confection found throughout the wasteland in a state of preservation that itself resists easy explanation. The nutritional label printed on the packaging, readable by those who inspect the item closely, contains caloric and macronutrient information that does not produce accurate totals when calculated. The numbers, as recorded, do not add up to the figure listed as the complete caloric content. Whether this reflects a difference in pre-war nutritional science, a difference in how pre-war corporate labeling operated, or simply an error made during the label's creation, cannot be determined from surviving records. The label remains mathematically inconsistent on every box found across the desert. Turbo, the combat stimulant that briefly distorts the passage of time for those who use it, has a more traceable origin than most substances found in the Mojave. The formula was developed at Big MT, the Big Mountain Research and Development Center, as part of the facility's extensive experimentation with compounds affecting biological perception and response. The formula was later acquired by the Great Khans, who refined and manufactured it for distribution across the wasteland. The supply chain connecting a research institution to a gang's production facility to the courier's inventory can be followed step by step through available records and optional conversations. Almost no one followed it. The regional beverage industry of the pre-war Southwest left its own traces in the distribution of Nuka-Cola variants found across the Mojave. Alongside the standard formula, 2 regional products were developed specifically for the Southwestern market, Nuka-Cola Quartz and Nuka-Cola Victory. The existence of these variants implies that the Nuka-Cola Corporation maintained separate product lines calibrated to regional consumer preferences, that the pre-war beverage industry was sophisticated enough to conduct market research, develop regional formulas, and distribute them through separate supply chains to different parts of the country. The wasteland does not explain this infrastructure. It simply contains the evidence of it. Abraxo Cleaner, a pre-war cleaning product found across multiple Fallout records, is present in the Mojave in 2 forms. The original pre-war packaging is common in preserved structures throughout the wasteland. Also present is a version labeled Abraxo Cleaner Industrial Grade, a post-war designation applied to a variant that should not, by any reasonable accounting, exist. Someone in the wasteland is manufacturing cleaning products under the Abraxo brand. No surviving record identifies who this manufacturer is, where they operate, or how they obtained the rights or the formula. The brand persists in the wasteland without a visible origin, producing goods that continue to appear on shelves. The weapon modification system introduced in New Vegas was built with a physical specificity that most who used it never examined. Each modification, extended magazine, scope, suppressor, bayonet, was designed as a distinct 3-dimensional object. When attached to a weapon, the modification was rendered visibly on the weapon's model, occupying the physical space it would occupy on a real firearm. Separate assets were constructed for each attachment, visible only when held. Dozens of individual objects were built for components that most who carried modified weapons never looked at closely enough to see. Even the currency carried throughout the Mojave was built with detail that exceeds what normal use would ever reveal. The cap model, the Nuka-Cola bottle cap that serves as the Mojave's primary medium of exchange, was rendered with a defined interior surface. The underside of the cap, textured with the Nuka-Cola logo as seen from below, exists as a completed asset within the cap's construction. During normal use, a cap rests flat, right side up, and the interior surface is never visible. The texture was built for an angle that no ordinary interaction produces. It exists regardless. Certain items were built for functions that were removed before the Mojave's record was finalized. Pencils, tin cans, small toy vehicles, objects categorized as junk and found throughout the ruins, were originally intended to be throwable, serving as improvised distractions that could redirect the attention of those who might otherwise detect the courier's presence. Gia the mechanic was removed before completion. The objects remained, reclassified as items with no function beyond occupying weight in the courier's inventory. A pencil in the Mojave weighs 1 pound and does nothing. It remains as evidence of something the wasteland once planned to allow. The Bowie knife, by contrast, has never required justification. Its item description notes that the design, a large fixed blade knife developed in the early 19th century, has remained essentially unchanged for over 300 years. In the timeline of the Mojave, that continuity extends even further. The knife predates the pre-war period. It predates the conditions that produced the wasteland. It is, in that sense, one of the oldest functional designs still in active use, a tool that survived the apocalypse not because it was engineered for post-war conditions, but because it was already, before any war occurred, exactly what a knife needed to be. The Repcon rockets, found within the Repcon test facility and connected to the account of a ghoul community in the basement levels, were built and tested before the war ended. Terminal entries within the facility describe successful propulsion tests conducted in 2074, 3 years before the Great War. The rockets were ready. The systems were certified. The community of ghouls who intended to use them was not prepared, for reasons that accumulated over 200 years of isolation and delay. The launch did not happen in 2074. It did not happen for 2 centuries after that. The rockets sat in their housings, fully functional, waiting for a mission that was always almost ready to begin. The wasteland is full of things that were almost ready. The bombs fell on a world that had not quite finished building itself, and the things left behind carry the weight of everything they were supposed to become. The living things of the Mojave wasteland were not produced by the same processes that shaped the wasteland's objects and ruins. Objects were left behind when the people who made them stopped. The creatures of the desert were transformed, altered by radiation, by deliberate engineering, by the forced evolutionary virus, or simply by the slow pressure of 2 centuries of surviving in conditions that were never designed to sustain life. What emerged from that transformation was not always what anyone intended, and in several cases was not intended at all. Death claws were intended. The base organism selected for modification was the Jackson's chameleon, a small, relatively docile reptile native to Africa, chosen for specific biological characteristics that made it suitable for the transformation that was being designed. The forced evolutionary virus, or FEV, was applied to alter and amplify those characteristics, scaling the organism from a creature measured in inches to one measured in feet, replacing passive behavior with aggressive territorial instinct, and replacing fragility with a physical durability capable of damaging military-grade power armor. The project was documented as a success. The documentation did not address what success of this kind would eventually mean for anyone who encountered the result outside of controlled conditions. One of the behaviors most associated with death claws in the Mojave is the slow circular movement they sometimes display when they have lost track of a target. Those who observed this behavior consistently interpreted it as evidence of a searching intelligence, a creature methodically covering ground in an effort to reacquire what it had detected. The behavior is not the product of intelligence. It is the product of a failure in the detection radius code, a loop that activates when the creature's targeting system cycles through states without resolving. The Deathclaw's most unsettling behavior was never designed. It was simply never corrected. The Nightkin, a variant of supermutant that developed from prolonged use of stealth boys, devices that render the user invisible through light-bending technology, present a different challenge to easy categorization. Tabitha, she who controls the radio installation at Black Mountain and has been broadcasting her perspective across the Mojave for an indeterminate period, demonstrates vocabulary, organizational thinking, and the capacity for ongoing interpersonal relationships that mark her as fully intelligent. The damage produced by stealth boy dependency, the psychosis that afflicts all Nightkin who use the devices extensively, is present and visible in her behavior. It does not eliminate her intelligence. It coexists with it. Tabitha wanted a place where she would not be hunted. The wasteland did not provide one. Centaurs represent a different outcome of FEV exposure, one that was not produced by the directed application of the virus to a single species, but by the uncontrolled exposure of multiple organisms simultaneously. The biological merging that resulted combined human, canine, and feline genetic material into configurations that do not correspond to any pre-war organism. The models of centaurs found in the Mojave contain internal texture details that suggest multiple sets of limbs in various states of incomplete integration, visible only through close examination of a dead specimen. The merger was not completed. It was simply stopped at whatever stage the organisms reached before the process ended. Cazadores were engineered at Big MT as territorial control mechanisms, creatures designed to make specific areas of terrain impassable to enemy forces by establishing an aggressive and persistent biological presence. The wasps that served as the base organism were selected for their natural aggression and their capacity to be enhanced through FEV modification to a size and lethality that would constitute a credible obstacle to trained soldiers. They were released into the Mojave as a field test of this capability. The bombs fell before the test was formally concluded. The Cazadores have been running the test without supervision ever since, establishing and defending territory across the desert with the same aggression they were designed to produce 2 centuries past the end of the program that created them. Geckos occupy a different position in the Mojave's biological history. The large mutant lizards found across the American Southwest in the wasteland records were not engineered. They were not subjected to directed FEV application or targeted modification. They evolved over generations of exposure to ambient radiation, from the ordinary pre-war geckos that inhabited the region before the Great War. The fire-breathing variant, which developed a biological organ capable of producing and igniting flammable gas, represents an ability that arose entirely through natural selection, operating within irradiated conditions. No design specification anticipated it. The wasteland produced it anyway, without consultation. Ghouls present a different kind of open question. The transformation that radiation exposure produces in some human survivors, the cellular adaptation that results in the dramatic physical changes and extended lifespan associated with ghoul physiology, has never been assigned a defined upper limit. Raul Alfonso Tejada, the ghoul encountered imprisoned at Black Mountain, is approximately 235 years old. Cooper Howard, documented in the Fallout television series as a ghoul who was alive before the Great War, has survived for a comparable period. No surviving record establishes the point at which ghoul lifespan ends naturally. The implication, never stated directly in any available account, is that it may not end at all, absent external cause. Brahmin, the two-headed cattle that serve as pack animals and food sources throughout the wasteland, offer a simpler kind of mystery. The bilateral duplication of their heads, consistent across every regional record from every part of the wasteland, represents a stable mutation produced by radiation exposure in the bovine species. Though no available lore entry explains what survival advantage the second head provides. From a biological standpoint, the duplication does not appear to confer any specific benefit. Brahmins survived the apocalypse, not because their mutation gave them an edge, but because cattle are, fundamentally, difficult to eliminate. The wasteland did not improve them. It simply failed to remove them. Rad scorpions descend from bark scorpions, a species native to the American Southwest that was, even before the Great War, among the most venomous scorpions found in North America. The FEV and radiation that reshaped them scaled their physical size from a few inches to the dimensions of a large dog, while the venom that the original organism carried was maintained and amplified rather than diluted by the transformation. The rad scorpion was not created dangerous, it was made larger. The danger preceded the wasteland by millions of years of evolution. Mealurks, the large crustacean mutations documented extensively in the capital wasteland of Fallout 3 and in the Commonwealth records of Fallout 4, are absent from the Mojave. A single terminal entry references them in a context that is not serious. Their absence was designed to reflect the actual ecology of the region. The dry desert climate of Nevada and the surrounding Southwest is inhospitable to the crustacean biology that Mealurks represent. The creature population of the Mojave was built to correspond to the real ecology of the region. Reptiles, insects, and mammals adapted to arid conditions. Rather than simply populating the wasteland with every creature that exists elsewhere in the series, one creature in the Mojave was documented primarily through the account of its own survival. The legendary bloatfly is known through a series of researchers' notes that track attempts to locate and study it. Each entry in the series describes the approach, the encounter, and ends without a conclusion that the writer was present to provide. The last entry is unfinished. The bloatfly's legendary status is established entirely by the absence of anyone who successfully documented it, by the pattern of incomplete records left behind by those who tried and did not return to complete their notes. The Deathclaw promontory, located on the Mojave's eastern edge, was not marked on any map available to those who traveled the wasteland. No account directed anyone toward it. No warning was placed at its perimeter. So approximately 30 Deathclaws occupy a space smaller than a city block within its boundaries. The location was placed in the world without signage or direction, and those who found it did so by moving through the desert in a direction that no formal account suggested. It remains among the most discussed hidden places in the Mojave's geography, known entirely because some people walked the wrong way and survived long enough to tell someone about it. The creatures of the Mojave did not choose what they became. The radiation chose for them, and the wasteland accepted the result. The only choice that remained was whether to survive it. The major factions of the Mojave, the New California Republic, Caesar's Legion, Mr. House's Operation, the Independent Option, receive the most attention from those who document the wasteland. They are the largest, the loudest, the most consequential in terms of what happens to Hoover Dam and the future it controls. But the Mojave is also populated by smaller organizations, each with its own history and its own particular form of damage, most of which can be discovered only by those who look past the main conflict into the quieter corners of the desert. The Boomers occupy Nellis Air Force Base, northeast of the Strip, and they do not welcome visitors. Their hostility to outsiders is expressed through heavy artillery, a preference for explosive resolution that defines the first impression they make on anyone who approaches their territory without an invitation. That preference is not aesthetic. The Boomers are descended from a group of survivors who escaped Vault 34, the vault designed with an overstocked armory and no restrictions on access. The population of that vault destroyed itself through faction conflict over its weapons. The people who left took everything they could carry and built, from the ruins of that experience, a philosophy of absolute self-sufficiency and absolute distrust of anyone outside their walls. The explosives are the philosophy made physical. The kings, who control Freeside's streets outside the Strip's walls, built their identity around a different inheritance. The gang is organized around the aesthetic and philosophy of a pre-war entertainer, known only through film recordings found in the school of impersonation that serves as their headquarters. The king himself, the man who leads the organization, has no name that anyone in Freeside uses or remembers. He is called the king because the persona he has inhabited has replaced whatever identity existed before it. The performance has become the person. His original name is not accessible even to himself, or if it is, he has chosen not to use it. The entertainer, the king's worship, is never named in any surviving record. He is described as a singer with a distinctive voice and a particular physical presentation. A pompadour, a white performance suit, a guitar that the kings reproduce with faithful consistency across their clothing and manner. The man is gone. The cultural moment he represented is gone. What remains in Freeside is a community organized around the performance of a memory of a person, sustained entirely by recordings made before the world ended. The kings are a tradition that exists only because something was preserved when everything else was lost. The followers of the apocalypse, who maintain their operations out of the old Mormon fort in Freeside, work from a building that predates the pre-war period entirely. The fort was constructed in the 1850s, making it among the oldest structures in the Mojave by any measure. Within it, the followers maintain a medical archive that includes textbooks written before the Great War, before the conditions that produce the wasteland's particular range of injuries and illnesses existed in any form. The medicine practiced at the old Mormon fort is drawn from books that could not have anticipated what would eventually be required of them. The knowledge is 200 years old, and the injuries are also 200 years old. And the gap between what the books describe and what the patients present is something the followers have spent generations learning to bridge. The Fiends, the raider organization that controls the areas surrounding Camp McCarran and the ruins to the south, were not always as large as they became. Their growth was directly connected to the expansion of chem production by the Great Khans, whose manufacturing operation in Red Rock Canyon produced the supply that the Fiends consumed and distributed. The Fiends are, in part, an ecological consequence of the drug trade, rather than an independent organization that grew on its own terms. Their leadership, Motor Runner, Cook, Driver Nephi and Violet, were each given individual names, individual faces, and individual weapons. More personalization was invested in the leaders of the Fiends than in most named figures found across the wasteland. The Powder Gangers are still wearing their prison uniforms. The former NCR prisoners, who escaped from the NCR correctional facility during a riot have been free for months, and in that time they have not changed their clothing. The uniforms are the standard issue garments distributed to those imprisoned by the Republic, identifiable, institutional, marking their wearers as people who were once held. The powder gangers wear them not because they have no other option, but because no account of their life in the wasteland treats the clothing as something requiring a decision. They escaped, and they immediately resumed the activities that resulted in their imprisonment. The uniforms are incidental to that. The behavior was always theirs. The Omertas, who run the Gomorrah Casino, did not inherit their organizational structure from any external source. There is no surviving mafia for them to belong to, no larger criminal organization that the Gomorrah operates as a branch of. The Omertas reconstructed their hierarchy, with its code of silence, its Italian-American cultural terminology, its specific model of internal discipline and external presentation, from historical records of how such organizations once functioned. The name Omerta, which refers specifically to the prohibition against cooperating with outside authorities, was adopted as a statement of organizational principle. The structure is a recreation built from documentation, and it governs a casino that has been running on that recreation ever since. The chairmen were given their structure rather than choosing it. Before Mr. House identified them as suitable for the role he needed filled on the strip, the chairmen were known as the Mojave Boot Riders, a tribal raiding group with no fixed aesthetic, no particular cultural identity, and no connection to the entertainment traditions that now define them. Mr. House provided the clothing, the philosophy, and the context, the Rat Pack aesthetic, the expectation of hospitality, and the performance of a specific cultural moment. In exchange for the loyalty and cooperation he required, the chairmen did not become who they are. They were assigned it. Caesar's legion absorbed rather than assigned. The tribal groups encountered and incorporated during the legion's expansion through the southwest were not given new identities so much as stripped of their old ones. The twisted hairs, who cooperated with the legion voluntarily in exchange for what they understood to be an alliance, were absorbed and dissolved. Their members redistributed, their name retired, their cooperative gesture repaid with erasure. The dead horses, documented in the Honest Hearts expansion, reached a different accommodation, one that preserved more of their autonomy through the specific circumstances of their encounter with the Legion's reach. The difference in outcomes reflects no difference in what the Legion wanted. It reflects only the different conditions under which the contact occurred. The Brotherhood of Steel, chapter operating in the Mojave, has been underground for years. Hidden Valley, the installation where Elder McNamara's chapter is based, has been under lockdown since a series of conflicts with NCR forces depleted the chapter's numbers and exposed its location. The Brotherhood preserves technology. That function continues, and the archive within Hidden Valley reflects the full depth of the Order's commitment to that preservation. The technology they preserve, however, is no longer being used to interact with the wasteland that surrounds the installation. The Brotherhood is maintaining a perfect record of what exists while ceasing to participate in the survival of the people who might benefit from what that record contains. Their archive is intact. They are running out of time. The Enclave remnants, brought together through Arcade Gannon's personal history, are the last documented members of the Enclave operating in the Mojave. The Enclave, the shadow continuation of the pre-war federal government, documented most extensively in Fallout 2 and Fallout 3, was effectively dismantled through military action. The individuals who remained scattered rebuilt quiet lives in separate locations and have not operated as an organization for years. When reunited, they remember their training with the completeness that military conditioning produces. They are also old and tired. She and they have spent considerable time living as something other than what they were. They are, when gathered in the same room, the most dangerous collection of individuals that most parts of the Mojave would ever encounter. They are also finished. At the start of the courier's time in the Mojave, at least 20 distinct named factions are present and operational across the desert. By the time the road ends, some of those factions will have been destroyed, some reformed, and some left entirely unchanged by whatever path was taken. The design of the wasteland allows for a Mojave in which almost everything survives in some form. That option was not included because it is the easiest outcome to reach. It was included because the people who designed the wasteland believed that not every problem in it requires a solution. The Mojave was always too large for any one organization to hold. Factions rose, drew borders, named enemies, and called it civilization. The desert did not notice. It had been there before all of them. The Mojave wasteland is larger than the roads that cross it. For those who follow the marked paths, the routes indicated by compass and quest and the steady accumulation of directed objectives, a significant portion of the desert remains entirely unseen. Over 100 locations exist across the wasteland that were never flagged on any compass, never referenced in any formal record, never indicated as destinations by any person or terminal or map. They hold environmental storytelling, preserved objects, creatures, and fragments of history. They were placed there without announcement. They remain without one. The Nipton Road rest stop sits along a highway that most who travel the southern Mojave pass through in connection with other destinations. The stop itself holds a crashed delivery truck, its cargo scattered around it in the particular way that impact and 2 centuries of stillness produce. The boxes of fancy lad snack cakes that were being transported remain intact, still edible in the manner of pre-war preserved food. The driver is present, a skeleton settled into the seat, arranged by the moment of the crash into a position that has not changed since. No record directed anyone to this location. The truck was going somewhere. The destination remains unknown. Elsewhere in the eastern Mojave, a pre-war satellite rests where it fell sometime after the Great War. A piece of orbital infrastructure that survived the bombs, only to come down afterward, landing in the desert without ceremony. The satellite model was built with its solar panels still partially extended. She's still positioned as if the system was attempting to continue its function after its connection to anything that could receive its transmissions had ended. There are no enemies at this location. There is nothing to collect. The satellite was placed there because the wasteland needed to contain evidence that the world had also extended into space, and that space had also been abandoned. The cliff's edge north of the main travel routes holds a skeleton seated at the precipice, facing outward over the flatlands of the Mojave. Beside it, an empty whiskey bottle. Beside that, a note. The note contains 4 words. Worth it. No author. No date. No indication of what was being assessed. What experience or decision, or view or choice, had been measured against whatever cost preceded the moment of writing. The note was written to be found without being understood. The wasteland contains it as a permanent question, and the question remains permanently open. The abandoned Brotherhood of Steel bunker, located outside Hidden Valley, represents a different kind of unanswered record. The facility appears older than the active installation nearby, a structure that predates the current chapter's occupation of the area, built and then decommissioned before the lockdown that has kept the Brotherhood underground for years. Its terminals have been wiped. Its power systems are dead. The removal of whatever was stored there was conducted carefully. Nothing left behind, no explanation offered. The Brotherhood of Steel is an organization built around the preservation of everything. Someone within it chose to preserve nothing here and left no account of why. The Mojave Drive-In was never completed before the Great War and was never reopened after it. The outdoor screen stands at its original height. The projection booth contains its equipment in the arrangement it was left in. A film canister remains loaded in the projector, a system that has not functioned in over 2 centuries. The label on that canister references a fictional pre-war film title that appears nowhere else in any surviving record of the Fallout universe. The title was written specifically for that label on that prop in that unmarked location. It exists for those who read it. There is no other reason for it to exist at all. Wolfhorn Ranch, south of Jacobstown in the northern Mojave, contains a campfire that burns. The fire burns throughout the day, through the night, regardless of whether anyone is present to tend it. No resident is assigned to the ranch. No formal record directs anyone there. The fire is simply maintained by the world as a persistent feature of the location, burning as if the person who lit it stepped away recently and intends to return. The ranch does not indicate whether that return is expected or merely possible. The fire continues in the absence of any answer. The REPCON headquarters building, accessible in the northern Mojave, preserves the corporate history of a pre-war aerospace company in a depth that most structures do not achieve. Among the terminal entries within the facility is a final internal memo, dated October 22nd, 2077, one day before the Great War ended the world that the memo was written in. The memo discusses a scheduling delay in a planned rocket launch and closes with 4 words. Will address Monday. Monday was October 27th, 2077. The bombs fell on October 23rd. The matter was not addressed on Monday. It was not addressed again. Hidden Valley contains more than the active Brotherhood installation. A secondary bunker within the complex holds historical records extending back to the immediate post-war period, accounts of the decisions made by the original members of what would become the Brotherhood of Steel. Those records reveal that the founding ideology of technology preservation was not the product of prior conviction. It was the product of fear. The people who established the Brotherhood were frightened survivors of a military organization who concluded, in the chaos that followed the Great War, that controlling access to technology was the only form of power that remained meaningful. The ideology came second. The fear came first. Vault 3 in the southwestern Mojave was one of the vaults that functioned as intended. Its overseer opened the sealed door peacefully when conditions permitted. Its residents survived the transition into the post-war world without catastrophic internal conflict. The terminal records within the common room, still readable, now surrounded by the presence of the Fiend Gang that subsequently broke in and occupied the facility, describe a stable community in their final entries. The last entry before contact with the outside world began is optimistic. It looks forward to what comes next. The next thing was the Fiends. That quality of optimism in a final entry is not unique to Vault 3. Across the unmarked locations of the Mojave, terminal entries and handwritten notes and personal logs end in ways that reflect the ordinary texture of the moment the Great War interrupted. A maintenance worker's log ends with a reminder about groceries. A mother's personal diary closes with the observation that dinner is nearly ready. These final entries were written to represent not the dramatic conclusion of a world, but the undramatic middle of an ordinary day, the specific moment that the bombs chose as their point of interruption. The wasteland is full of things that were in the middle of something when everything stopped. Dinky the dinosaur, the large roadside attraction that marks the town of Novak from a distance visible across the flat expanse of the surrounding desert, was in the middle of something as well. A terminal entry within the structure reveals that routine maintenance was underway on October 23rd, 2077. The maintenance crew was inside. Their tools were set down in the course of normal work. The tools remain inside the structure 200 years later, in the positions they were left in when the crew stopped working. The maintenance was never completed. Dinky stands in the Mojave, partially serviced, frozen in the middle of a task that no one has returned to finish. The world ended in the middle of things. Fires still burning. Rockets delayed until Monday. Dinosaurs half maintained. The wasteland is not a place after the end. It is a place inside an interruption that never resolved. Beneath the surface of the Mojave wasteland, beneath its lore and its environmental storytelling, and its carefully placed objects and unmarked locations, there is another layer. The layer left by the people who constructed it. The production of New Vegas was conducted under unusual conditions in an unusually compressed period of time, by a team small enough that its members' individual choices are visible in the finished work. That visibility is itself a form of environmental storytelling, available to those who know where to look. The full account of New Vegas was developed by Obsidian Entertainment in approximately 18 months. The production timeline for comparable releases of that era typically extended across 3 to 4 years. The compressed schedule produced consequences that were visible at the time of release: technical instability, unresolved interactions between systems, the particular texture of a complex work that was finished at speed rather than at leisure. It also produced something else: a density of written content, of lore, of environmental detail and character depth that has rarely been matched in comparable productions conducted with more time available. The team was small, the output was not. The content that was cut before the account reached its final form remains in the underlying files, recoverable by those who know how to access it, leaving traces of what the Mojave was designed to contain before time constraints altered the design. The most extensive area of removed content surrounds the town of Prim, which was built to support a more involved account of how a settlement without existing governance structures establishes new ones after external intervention. 2 additional named figures were designed for that account. A mechanic that would have allowed for something resembling collective decision-making was built and removed before it could be adequately tested. Prim remained, simplified, as the version that time permitted. The opening animated sequence, the hand-drawn Vault Boy illustrations that play across the initial loading screens, was produced by a single artist working against a deadline that allowed for significantly less time than the work required. The animations represent some of the most detailed hand-drawn assets in the entire production. They were completed within the available window and have since become, for many who encountered them, the visual element most immediately associated with New Vegas's particular identity. A single person, working quickly, produced what functions as the production's visual signature. The world map that those animations introduce was constructed from aerial survey data of real southern Nevada geography, compressed to allow traversal within a reasonable span of time. The actual distances between Las Vegas, Hoover Dam, and the settlements to the southwest are far greater than the wasteland represents. The geographic relationships, however, are accurate. Good Springs sits to the southwest of the Strip, because Good Springs actually sits to the southwest of Las Vegas, and Hoover Dam sits to the southeast because the real dam sits to the southeast of the city. The wasteland is a scaled model of a place that exists, reduced to a size that allows it to be walked. The dam itself was modeled with architectural accuracy that extended to the specific structures found within the real facility. The intake towers, the turbine halls, the visitor observation areas, all were reproduced with sufficient fidelity that those who had visited the actual site before traveling through its wasteland equivalent found the layout immediately recognizable. The final battle of New Vegas, in which the future of the Mojave is decided through violence at the dam's surface installations, takes place in a location where guided tours were once conducted for the general public at a cost of $11 per person. The battlefield was, before the war, a tourist attraction. The philosophical content embedded in that battle's central antagonist was drawn from sources well outside the conventions of the genre. Lead designer John Gonzalez has described the influence of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian on the design of Caesar's Legion and on the portrayal of violence as a force that, under certain conditions, operates as a civilizing mechanism rather than simply a destructive one. The arguments that Caesar makes about the nature of historical progress, about the dialectical relationship between order and chaos, incorporate the philosophical framework of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the 19th century philosopher whose concept of historical development through contradiction was applied directly to a warlord standing in the ruins of Nevada. The antagonist was written with the same sources that graduate seminars use. Ulysses was written as a response to the philosophical problem that the blank protagonist creates. Chris Avellone, the writer responsible for the Lonesome Road expansion and much of the broader DLC content, designed Ulysses specifically to pose the question that blank protagonists are constructed to avoid: whether the absence of a defined identity constitutes a legitimate claim to the role of protagonist at all. Ulysses does not attack the courier with violence as a primary strategy. He attacks with an argument. He is the most extended written engagement in the production, with the question of what the courier's existence actually means. That engagement was designed to be losable in a specific way. The final confrontation with Ulysses is one of the only moments in the Mojave's account where the courier can be genuinely countered in dialogue, where a response can be met with a refutation that the standard tools of persuasion cannot overcome. Speech, barter, charisma, the numerical systems that govern most conversational outcomes, do not resolve the confrontation. The only path through it is comprehension. Those who had read every terminal entry in the Divide, who had followed Ulysses's argument across its full length, were given the material to answer it. Those who had not were not. Reading carefully enough also revealed signatures that were not formally announced. Ja's surface in an otherwise empty building in the northern Mojave carries a texture file containing the initials of a member of the production team, pressed into the visual representation of a rock face, visible only when examined from a specific angle at close range. The building has no named inhabitants, no connection to any formal account, no reason to enter. The initials were placed there with the understanding that the building would likely never be visited by most who traveled the wasteland. They were placed there anyway. The RepCon test site contains a terminal entry that does not match the register of the entries surrounding it. The entry is longer than the others. Its philosophical texture is different, more personal in its concerns, more willing to engage with questions that the setting does not require it to address. Those who recovered and examined the underlying files identified it as the work of a different member of the production team, than the one responsible for the surrounding content. Someone who used the assignment as an opportunity to write something they wanted to write, rather than something the world specifically required. The entry was kept in the final account without alteration. The production credits for New Vegas list over 300 individual contributors. Several names appear more than once, assigned to different roles across the production, an indication of how completely the team's members overlapped in their responsibilities. At least 6 of those credited as designers also hold credits as writers. The credits sequence plays over the ambient score of New Vegas, and its length, unusual for a production of this scale, given how small the team actually was, reflects a kind of comprehensive acknowledgement that each person who worked on the Mojave was a significant fraction of the whole. The exhaustion is documented quietly in how long the list runs. The production was assessed when it was released as technically inferior to its predecessor. The critical score assigned to New Vegas at launch was lower than the score assigned to Fallout 3. In the years that followed, that assessment was revised by the same communities that had initially made it. The retrospective standing of New Vegas across multiple formats of critical and audience evaluation consistently places it above the game it was initially ranked below. The Wasteland, it turns out, rewards patience. The full account of what it contains takes time to appreciate. The people who built the Mojave left traces of themselves inside it, in rock textures, in terminal entries, in initials pressed into virtual debris. They made a world and signed it in the margins, where only the curious would ever find their names. The Mojave Wasteland was documented once in the form of a video game released in 2010. It was documented again in a different medium more than 15 years later, through a television production that traveled to the same geography and found much of it still standing. The relationship between the two accounts is not one of simple adaptation. It is something more like inheritance. One version of the wasteland passing something to the next, which then added its own layer without erasing what had come before. The Fallout television series, produced by Amazon Prime Video, in collaboration with the holders of the franchise's rights, premiered in April 2024. Its first season was set primarily in and around the ruins of Los Angeles, the California wasteland rather than the Nevada one. But the backstory of that season was threaded through with events that connected directly to what had been documented in New Vegas. The destruction of Shady Sands, the settlement that had grown from a small farming community into the capital of the new California Republic, was depicted as a significant post-war event. The timeline placed that destruction after the events of New Vegas, in which the NCR had been established as the dominant institutional force in the southwestern wasteland. The destruction of Shady Sands created a complication that the production chose to acknowledge rather than resolve. For New Vegas contains multiple possible outcomes, accounts of the Mojave that differ depending on the choices made along the way, some of which significantly strengthen the NCR, and some of which significantly weaken it. The production confirmed that it had selected one set of outcomes as the basis for its continuity. It did not specify which set. The question of which ending is treated as the foundation of the television account remains officially unanswered. No formal record closes that question. The game's endings remain, in an official sense, open. The team responsible for the television production spent 2 years in preparation before filming began. The lead writer, Graham Wagner, and showrunner, Geneva Robertson-Dorette, described their approach in terms that distinguished it from conventional adaptation. Rather than treating the games as material to be converted into a different format, they treated them as primary records. as documentation of a world they were being asked to inhabit rather than translate. The distinction shaped how the production engaged with material from across the full scope of the series, including the content of New Vegas. The second season, released across December 2025 and January and February 2026, moved its primary setting into the Mojave itself. New Vegas, the city, the strip, the surrounding desert, became the main environment of the season's account. The sets built to represent the strip were constructed with specific reference to the visual design of the wasteland as it had been documented in the game. Updated to reflect the additional years that had passed between the game's 2028-1 setting and the timeline in which the television account takes place. The world was not reproduced. It was continued. Mr. House was given a physical presence in the television account that the game had left partially unresolved. The game shows his deteriorated body briefly in specific circumstances, without directing sustained attention toward it. The television version, portrayed by Justin Theroux, was designed to make that physical condition more fully visible, to give the audience a sustained encounter with what 2 centuries of machine-assisted survival has produced in the man who controls the strip. Television committed to the image that the game had offered only in passing. The fundamental motivation, the long calculation about human survival and the role of control in ensuring it, was maintained without significant alteration. The Lucky 38 casino set was built with a specific acknowledgement embedded in its design. The roulette wheel logo on the casino's exterior, the one that has always displayed its colors in the incorrect sequence, was reproduced on the television version of the building with the colors still wrong. The production team was aware of the discussion that had accumulated around this detail across years of community engagement with the game. The decision to preserve the incorrect sequence rather than correct it was made deliberately as a recognition of the detail's history and of the audience that had spent years noting and debating it. Caesar's Legion, which occupies a significant portion of the Mojave's political landscape, was depicted in the second season with a visual specificity that the game had not provided. The game establishes the Legion's presence and its operations through dialogue, terminal entries, and the controlled environment of Fortification Hill. The television account showed the infrastructure that the game described: the camp organization, the supply networks, and most significantly, the enslaved people who were integrated into every aspect of Legion operations. The suffering that the game named without showing in full was given visual form. A sequence connected to Vault-21 provided the second season's most disturbing single moment by the production team's own account. The vault, which sits beneath the strip and whose lower levels were filled with cement by Mr. House after he purchased it, was depicted in a way that no previous visual account of the Fallout universe had attempted. The cement filling process, the physical act of sealing a vault and everyone's history within it beneath a hardening grey permanence, was shown directly. The showrunners described this sequence as the most difficult thing they chose to put on screen across both seasons of production. The Sierra Madre Casino, the location documented in the Dead Money expansion, sealed behind the toxic red gas known as the Cloud, was not depicted directly in the second season. It was referenced in dialogue, described by figures in the Mojave as a location that exists beyond a specific environmental barrier, accessible only at extreme risk. The description mirrors the account given in Dead Money itself, a place that is real enough to be warned about and dangerous enough to make the warning feel earned. The production treated the Sierra Madre as something the wasteland knows about but cannot visit, which is precisely how the expansion positioned it. Norm MacLean's investigation into the Vault-Tec program which began in the first season with his examination of the connected vault system housing the cryogenically preserved executives of Buds, continued in the second season with additional revelations about the program's intended post-war function. The executives in stasis were not preserved with the general goal of helping rebuild a functioning society. Their reactivation instructions prioritized the re-establishment of the corporate structures that had existed before the war, the restoration of Vault-Tec's institutional authority and market position in whatever world emerged from the ruins. The plan was not to rebuild civilization. The plan was to reclaim it. Cooper Howard, documented across both seasons as a ghoul who was alive in the pre-war period as a Hollywood actor, was given a scene in the second season set in the Las Vegas that existed before the bombs, fully operational, lit, crowded with the particular kind of pre-war energy that the wasteland retains only in traces and recordings. The sequence represented the single most expensive production element across both seasons by the production team's accounting. It was, in terms of what it cost to produce, the most expensive meditation on loss that the series had yet attempted. The third season of the television series has been announced, with available information suggesting a setting in the Commonwealth. The regions surrounding what was once Boston, documented most fully in Fallout 4. If that setting is confirmed, the 3 seasons of the production will have collectively covered California, the Mojave, and New England, the 3 geographic regions that define the primary settings of Fallout. Fallout, New Vegas, and Fallout 4, respectively. The television account will have traced the same path across the continent that the games traced across their releases, arriving at each location in the same order, finding it changed and continuing. The television cameras went where the game had already been and found the same thing waiting. The wasteland does not change based on who is looking at it. It simply reveals a different layer each time. The facts that remain are the smallest ones. The details discussed in this final chapter before the last are not the kind that shape the understanding of factions or the outcome of battles or the design philosophy of an entire production. They are the kind that exist in corners, in the sky above the wasteland, in the floors beneath buildings that were never finished, in the locations that were never formally identified as locations at all. They are offered here for those who are still present, and gently for those who are beginning to drift. The moon, visible above the Mojave on clear nights, is larger than the moon visible above any real location on Earth. The decision to make it larger was made during the art direction process, as part of a deliberate effort to introduce subtle wrongness into the wasteland sky, to make the environment feel not quite like the world the listener knows, even when the desert below it is modeled on real geography. The moon was not given a lore explanation. No terminal entry accounts for its size. It is simply there, larger than it should be, over a desert that otherwise attempts to be accurate. The stars surrounding that moon were placed according to a real astronomical map. The constellations visible in the night sky above New Vegas correspond to the constellations that would actually be visible from the Mojave Desert in the late autumn months, the season that the wasteland's climate design most closely suggests. Those with knowledge of real-world astronomy, she's standing in the right location at the right time of the in-world night cycle, could orient themselves by the stars above the wasteland as reliably as by any map the Pip-Boy provides. The sky was designed to be navigable. The maps within the Pip-Boy, the personal information device carried on the courier's wrist throughout the long road across the desert, do not display the unmarked locations documented in the previous chapter. The terrain features shown on those maps are, however, accurate enough to allow navigation without flagged destinations for those willing to learn the landscape by movement rather than by marker. The map was designed as a functional tool for those who chose to use it that way, not as a simplified guide to destinations, but as a representation of geography that rewards patient cross-referencing with the terrain itself. The speed at which the courier crosses that terrain was calibrated against real human movement data. The base walking speed was set at approximately 5 kilometers per hour, close to the average measured pace of a walking adult, and then reduced by approximately 15% to account for the weight of carried equipment and the difficulty of desert terrain. A courier carrying the maximum permitted load moves at roughly 4 kilometers per hour. These calculations were maintained in the design documentation and referenced when the distances between locations were determined. The wasteland was built to be traversed at a human pace. The slowest inhabitants of that wasteland move at a pace below even a heavily burdened courier. Brahmin, the two-headed cattle that carry supplies across the desert and provide the wasteland's primary source of meat and leather, cannot run. They cannot be prompted to move more quickly than their standard gait. At irregular intervals, they stop entirely, lower their two heads toward the ground, and perform an eating animation against terrain that contains no visible food. The animation plays on bare desert sand, on cracked asphalt, on the floors of ruined buildings. The Brahmin believe, or behave, as if they believe, that there is something worth consuming beneath them. The wasteland does not correct this impression. The Lucky 38's elevator travels between the casino's accessible levels through a button panel that lists more floors than the building reveals. Floor 4 is listed on the panel. Floor 4 cannot be selected, and no companion remarks on the button. No terminal entry references the floor it would serve. No available account explains whether Floor 4 represents a level that was designed and removed before the account of the casino was finalized, or whether it was placed on the panel as a suggestion that Mr. House's building contains more than visitors are permitted to see. Both explanations are consistent with what is known about the man who owns it. The Gomorrah Casino contains a room that was not designed to be entered. Two wall mesh components in a back section of the casino do not connect fully, leaving a gap in the collision geometry that can be passed through by those who find it. Beyond that gap is a space that was not completed before the account of the Mojave was sealed. Props placed without final textures applied, lighting set to placeholder colors, flooring that extends into a region of the world with no visual surface beneath it. The room exists. It was never finished. It remains accessible through an opening that was never intended to be one. The Pip-Boy's integrated light source, a small lamp mounted on the wrist-worn device, was designed to illuminate the immediate area around the courier in dark environments. In practice, the light source occasionally illuminates objects through solid geometry, casting visible light into adjacent spaces that solid walls should prevent it from reaching. Those exploring dark vault environments have been alerted to the presence of rooms they had not yet discovered by a glow coming through the wall. The Pip-Boy's light finding gaps in the geometry that the physical representation of the wall does not reveal. The device reveals space that the world was not intending to show. The moment that follows the courier's recovery in Goodsprings, the first time they crest the hill to the east and the Mojave spreads out before them in full, was designed to produce a specific emotional response. The design team referred to this moment in their documentation as the postcard, the image that was intended to communicate the scale of what was being entered before any formal description of it could be provided. The music changes at this moment. The desert opens. The distant glow of the strip is visible on the horizon. The moment was built to feel like arriving somewhere. The postcard view from that hill contains, within its visible range, at least 4 locations connected to formal accounts of the Mojave, none of which are identified as such in the moment of that first view. Those who had already traveled the wasteland and returned to the opening hill could look out at the same view and find their own history distributed across it. The locations where things had happened arranged in the same visual field as the horizon that had preceded all of them. The Mojave is a place where the past remains visible from the right position. The ridge that appears in the account's default conclusion, the location where the courier is depicted standing at dawn, looking out over the desert as the ending resolves, exists within the accessible geography of the wasteland. So those who found that ridge during their travels stood in the same position from which the concluding image was constructed. The ending was not filmed against a separate backdrop. It was filmed inside the world the courier had been walking through. The location was always present, available to anyone who moved across the desert in that direction, waiting without indication to serve eventually as the place where the story chose to end. 11 plastic dinosaur figures, small, distinct from the large roadside attraction that marks Novak, were distributed across the wasteland by a single member of the level design team. They appear in homes, in vaults, in abandoned commercial spaces, in locations spread across the full breadth of the geography. No formal account references them. No named figure in the wasteland acknowledges them. The reason for their placement has never been documented in any surviving record. They are there because someone put them there, without explanation, and the wasteland kept them. The smallest things in the Mojave were placed there by hands that will never hold them again. 11 plastic dinosaurs in 11 locations. A roulette wheel with the colors wrong. A postcard view from a hill outside a ghost town. The world was built to be found, and the finding, quiet as it is, was always the point. As this journey draws toward its quiet end, there are a few things left to say. Not facts in the way that a crashed truck or an incorrectly sequenced roulette wheel is a fact, but observations. Reflections that the wasteland makes available to those who have spent enough time inside it to stop looking for things and simply notice what is already there. The account of New Vegas does not end the same way twice. The slideshow that plays at the conclusion of each journey through the Mojave assembles itself from over 200 individual outcome slides, arranged according to choices made at hundreds of points across the full length of the road. The combination produced by one set of decisions is not reproduced by any other set. Each account of the Mojave ends with a conclusion that belongs exclusively to the journey that produced it. The wasteland was designed to give each traveler a version of what comes next that no one else has received in quite the same form. The journey began with the courier already dead. Shot in the head in the cemetery outside Goodsprings, buried in a grave marked with a name that no one else was present to choose, returned to life through the intervention of a man who found them by chance and a doctor who had no particular reason to spend the resources required to save an unknown delivery person. Everything that follows is built on that beginning, on the event that should have been the ending, on the survival that was not supposed to happen. The Mojave is what it looks like when someone continues past the point where they were supposed to stop. Every other person in the Mojave was also surviving past a point of supposed stopping. The 200 years that preceded the courier's arrival in the desert were not survived by the courier. They were survived by everyone else. The residents of Freeside, the soldiers at Camp McCarran, the inhabitants of Novak and Prim and Goodsprings, the members of every faction and the people attached to none of them, all of them were born into a world that had already ended and built their lives from whatever the ruins had left behind. The courier arrives in the Mojave as a newcomer to grief. The wasteland's other inhabitants have been living inside it for generations, which produces a different relationship to it than the courier's recovery can account for. Music was one of the things that grief did not eliminate. Pre-war recordings, stored on holotapes, broadcast through radio frequencies, preserved in the memory systems of robots that have been operating without meaningful maintenance for 2 centuries, continue to play across the Mojave. The songs that survived the Great War outlasted the people who wrote them, the cities where they were performed, the technology platforms through which they were first distributed, and the civilization that considered them entertainment. Music does not require any of those things to continue. It requires a signal and something capable of receiving it, and both of those things remain in the wasteland in sufficient quantity to keep the old songs moving. The factions of New Vegas are each a theory about what survival requires at the level of civilization rather than the individual. The New California Republic holds that survival requires democratic institutions and the rule of law, imperfect as both have become in their extended application across the southwestern wasteland. Caesar's Legion holds that survival requires order imposed without exception, and that the suffering produced by that imposition is the price of the stability it creates. Mr. House holds that survival requires control, exercised by someone sufficiently far-sighted and sufficiently capable to make the decisions that democratic institutions are too slow and too compromised to make correctly. The independent option holds that survival requires none of these things, only the refusal to accept someone else's terms. The Mojave does not declare any of these theories correct. It simply shows what each one costs when it is put into practice. The cost is paid by those who fight. The soldiers of the New California Republic who die at Hoover Dam during the battle that concludes the Mojave's account were following orders transmitted from General Oliver, who directed the engagement from a position sufficiently removed from the fighting to survive it. The soldiers of Caesar's Legion who die in the same battle were following the direction of Caesar himself, who observed from Fortification Hill across the river. The people who determined what the battle was for were not among the people who bled for it. This is a fact about the fictional battle at Hoover Dam, and it is also a fact about most of the real battles that the people who wrote it had access to as historical record. Mr. House resolved this gap between decision and consequence by removing both sides of it. His vision for the Mojave requires no army in the conventional sense and no democratic process to authorize its objectives. It requires compliance, the acceptance of his judgment about what the wasteland needs and what it will eventually become. He was building toward a future in which the people of the Mojave would be stable enough, comfortable enough, and organized enough to eventually leave the planet, to survive beyond the limits of the wasteland by reaching the stars that Raoul can still remember looking at before the bombs fell. The price of that future, in his design, G was the authority to make every significant decision about how it would be reached. His vision is not presented as evil. It is presented as the logical conclusion of a particular kind of intelligence applied to a particular kind of problem. Whether the conclusion is acceptable is left to those who encounter it. New Vegas was built with very few figures who are evil in the simple sense, who harm without a history that explains the harm, who destroy without a reasoning process that produced the destruction. The fiends are damaged people living inside the consequences of damage that preceded them. The Legion is structured around a philosophical framework, however brutal its application. Benny, who shot the courier in the head and started the whole account, was ambitious and frightened in roughly equal measure. Father Elijah, Shall the rogue Brotherhood of Steel, elder, whose obsession drives the events of Dead Money, became what he became through a grief that the records within the Sierra Madre make available to those who read them. The wasteland builds its figures from recognizable human material, from the ordinary conditions of fear and loss, and the desire for control that the wasteland intensifies without creating. The courier can, across the range of choices available in any given account, choose to hand the Mojave's future to any of these frameworks, or to destroy the framework that might have saved it, or to enslave the people who might have built something better. The account permits conclusions that most forms of storytelling would mark as failures. It permits them because the people who designed it believed that the meaning of a choice is not determined by whether it can be categorized as good or bad, but by what it costs and who bears the cost. The Mojave receives a consequence regardless. What that consequence is, and whether it was the right one, is carried afterward by the person who produced it. The wasteland remembers everything that happened in it. Terminal entries preserve grievances about air conditioning systems that failed in 2077. Skeletons remain in the positions they occupied when the Great War ended their movement. Wall clocks throughout the ruins display 7:22, the time of the disruption that stopped them, because no one has moved their hands in the 2 centuries since. The Mojave is a place where the past did not conclude. It simply stopped updating. And what it contained at the moment of stopping has been accumulating weight ever since. To move through the wasteland is to move through the middle of other people's interrupted stories, and to add one's own to the collection without knowing whether anyone will eventually read it. 180 separate details about one particular account of the wasteland have been offered here, across the length of this journey. That account was built in 18 months, by a team small enough that most of its members' individual contributions are identifiable within it. It was built in a desert that already existed, that predated the story placed inside it, that will exist after the story has been told in every possible variation and set aside. The Mojave that was borrowed for the production is the Mojave that receives the story's consequences, and it does not distinguish between the real and the fictional versions of the desert. It simply continues in both directions, before the account and after it, as desert does. The account of New Vegas does not know that it is an account. The skeletons it contains are always in the same positions. The fires it contains burn at their designated times. The 11 plastic dinosaurs scattered across its geography by a member of the level design team are always in their 11 locations, waiting in the homes and vaults and abandoned stores where they were placed, in a world that runs the same sequence endlessly, waiting for someone to arrive and begin the account again. Every beginning is the first time the wasteland has been walked through. The wasteland behaves, each time, as if it knew the traveler was coming. At the edge of the desert, past the last marked road and the last faction boundary, and the last visible glow of the strip's neon, the terrain continues. There is a boundary where the world ends, where the geography stops and the emptiness that surrounds all constructed worlds begins. But in the space just before that boundary, there is open ground, flat, empty. No enemies were placed there, no items were distributed, no terminal entries were left for those who reached it. There is the Nevada horizon and the slightly oversized moon above it, and the silence that the sound designers left unfilled in that space, because nothing that could be added to it would be more accurate than the absence itself. The wasteland grows quiet at its edges. The desert was always quieter than the stories told inside it. And the quiet, in the end, is where everything was always heading. If you are still here, let us know where you are watching from tonight. And if you have drifted somewhere along the way, that is exactly where this was always going. The wasteland will be here when you return. The lights of New Vegas burn through the night. The Brahmin are still searching for grass that is not there. The clocks still read 7:22. Sleep well. The Mojave keeps watch.